I wasn't supposed to speak at my sister's engagement party. I was supposed to smile, nod, and stay invisible, like always. Then Uncle James casually asked, "So how's life in that $1.5 million house you bought?" The room went silent. My sister froze. My parents turned pale. My father whispered, "James, what house?" I calmly lifted my glass and took a sip of wine while everyone stared at me like I'd just detonated a bomb. Because in that moment, the truth they'd spent years hiding was finally out, and there was no way to put it back. That I stood outside the banquet hall for a full minute before walking in, adjusting my coat, reminding myself to breathe. The place was glowing, warm lights, soft music, laughter spilling out every time the doors opened. It was my sister's engagement party, and everything about it screamed celebration. Everyone had shown up dressed to impress. Everyone except me, it seemed, was already perfectly comfortable belonging there. Inside, relatives filled the room, clustered in familiar groups. Hugs were exchanged, compliments flew freely, glasses clinked. I slipped in quietly, the way I always did, nodding, smiling, making myself small. No one rushed toward me. No one asked how I'd been. That was normal. I found an empty chair near the edge of the room and sat down, content to observe rather than participate. My sister stood at the center of it all, glowing, her engagement ring catching the light every time she moved her hand. People leaned in to admire it, to congratulate her, to tell her how proud they were. My parents hovered close, beaming, soaking in the attention like it was theirs too. They didn't look my way once. I told myself I was fine with it. I'd learned long ago not to expect much. Being overlooked had become familiar, almost comfortable. I sipped my drink slowly and watched conversations unfold, listened to half-remembered stories, smiled at jokes that weren't meant for me. Still, there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. A quiet thought whispered that I didn't have to be here. I could leave. No one would notice. I almost hoped for an excuse, some interruption, some reason to slip out unnoticed. But then Uncle James arrived. He walked in late, scanning the room with curious eyes, and when he spotted me, he smiled, really smiled. The kind that made you feel seen. He headed straight toward me, and for the first time that evening, I felt something shift. I had no idea that within minutes, everything about this party, and my place in this family, was about to change forever. Growing up, I learned early where I stood in my family, even though no one ever said it out loud. My sister was the shining star, the one whose achievements were framed, celebrated, retold at every gathering. Her birthdays were events. Her opinions mattered. When she spoke, everyone listened. When I spoke, conversations simply drifted past me, like I'd never opened my mouth at all. It wasn't cruelty in the obvious sense. There were no screaming matches or dramatic punishments. It was quieter than that. Subtle. When we both needed something, hers came first. When mistakes were made, mine were remembered longer. I was praised for being easy, for not needing much, for never causing trouble. At the time, I thought that was a compliment. As we got older, the gap widened. My sister's choices were supported, even when they failed. Mine were questioned before I ever took the first step. If I succeeded, it was brushed off as luck. If she stumbled, it became a family crisis. I learned to lower my expectations, to celebrate privately, to carry my disappointments alone. Family gatherings followed the same pattern. I became the listener, the observer, the one who showed up on time and left without fuss. No one asked about my goals. No one worried if I felt fulfilled. They assumed I was fine, because I always said I was. And maybe that was my fault. Silence became my shield. I didn't want attention if it came with scrutiny or resentment. I convinced myself it was easier this way, that staying in the background kept the peace. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't invisible because I lacked substance. I was invisible because it was convenient for everyone else. By the time my sister's engagement was announced, I'd already accepted my role. The less important one. The one who would clap, smile, and step aside. That night, sitting at the edge of the party, I thought I understood the rules completely. I didn't realize how fragile those rules really were. People often assume that hiding success means you're ashamed of it. For me, it was the opposite. I was proud of what I'd built, but I'd learned that pride could make you a target. In my family, good news had a way of turning sour. Achievements became comparisons. Milestones became uncomfortable questions. I didn't want my life measured against my sister's, or worse, used to make her feel smaller. So I learned to edit myself. When asked how work was going, I said, busy. When someone mentioned finances, I laughed it off. Promotions, bonuses, late nights that paid off, I kept those stories to myself. Not because they weren't important, but because peace mattered more. Or so I told myself. Buying the house was the biggest secret of all. It wasn't an impulse or a miracle. It was years of saving, calculated risks, and quiet discipline. I signed the papers alone, stood in the empty rooms alone, and celebrated alone. It felt strange and empowering at the same time. That house wasn't just property, it was proof that I was capable, independent, and far stronger than anyone realized. I told my parents I was renting. They nodded, satisfied, and never asked for details. My sister never knew. Part of me wondered what would happen if she did. Would she be proud? Or would it somehow become a problem I was expected to fix? Uncle James was the only exception. He noticed things. Asked thoughtful questions. When I mentioned the house casually months earlier, he raised his eyebrows, impressed, and congratulated me without envy or judgment. It felt safe to tell him the truth. That night at the engagement party, I believed my secret was still secure. I sat quietly, content in my anonymity, unaware that one offhand comment, one innocent question, was about to pull that truth into the open. And once it was out, there would be no controlling how people reacted to it. Uncle James had always been different from the rest of my family. He didn't hover around the loudest voices or chase attention. He watched. He listened. And when he spoke, it was usually after he'd noticed something everyone else had missed. As a kid, I used to sit near him at gatherings because he never talked over me. He waited. While others asked polite, forgettable questions, Uncle James asked the real ones. Not the kind meant to fill silence, but the kind that showed genuine interest. How was I really doing? What did I want next? What was challenging me lately? He didn't treat my answers like placeholders. He remembered them. As I got older, that didn't change. If anything, he became the only person who seemed to notice my growth. When I switched careers, he asked why. When I mentioned long hours, he asked what I was building toward. There was no judgment in his tone, just curiosity and quiet respect. The night of the engagement party, he arrived late, as usual, slipping in without fanfare. I noticed him scanning the room, taking in the decorations, the conversations, the subtle dynamics. When his eyes landed on me, his expression softened. He smiled like he'd found something familiar in a crowded place. He walked straight over and hugged me, asking how I'd been. I gave my usual careful answer, but he didn't let it slide. He asked follow-up questions, nodding thoughtfully, as if filing away details. I relaxed around him in a way I hadn't with anyone else that night. What I didn't realize then was that Uncle James had already connected dots no one else bothered to see. To him, my life wasn't a mystery or a footnote. It was a story unfolding, one he was genuinely invested in. And with one well-intentioned question, he was about to unknowingly flip the entire evening upside down. The music softened as dinner plates were cleared, and conversations blended into a low, comfortable hum. Uncle James stood beside me, glass in hand, casually scanning the room. My sister was laughing at something her fiancé said, my parents close by, basking in the attention. It looked like a perfect family moment. Then Uncle James turned back to me and said it, calmly, conversationally, with no idea what it would trigger. "So," he asked, "how's life in that $1.5 million house you bought?" The words didn't echo, but the silence that followed felt louder than music ever could. Laughter stopped mid-breath. Someone nearby cleared their throat. I felt every eye in the room shift toward us, drawn by instinct to the sudden tension. My sister's smile froze, her hand still wrapped around her fiancé's arm. My mother's face drained of color, the way it does when something goes terribly wrong. My father stiffened, his glass halfway to his lips, unsure whether to drink or set it down. No one spoke. For a split second, I considered laughing it off. Pretending it was a joke. Redirecting the moment the way I always had. Years of silence urged me to retreat. But something inside me resisted. I was tired of shrinking. I met Uncle James's gaze. He looked confused now, realizing he'd stepped into something unspoken. I took a slow breath, lifted my glass, and took a small sip, buying myself a moment. "I like it," I said simply. That was all. No bragging. No explanation. Just the truth, delivered quietly. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. The party didn't resume the way it had been before. Conversations stayed hushed. People watched my parents instead of my sister. In that single moment, the story everyone thought they knew about me cracked open, and there was no going back to why parents recovered first, or at least tried to. My mother forced a laugh that landed flat, the sound sharp and unnatural. "James," she said quickly, "you must be confused." She waved her hand like she could brush the moment away, like it was dust on the table. My father nodded beside her, eyes darting between faces, calculating damage. But the panic was already there. You could see it in the way my mother gripped her glass too tightly, in the way my father avoided looking directly at me. They weren't confused. They were afraid of questions they couldn't control. Uncle James frowned, clearly puzzled. "Confused?" he asked. "She told me months ago." I congratulated her. His voice was calm, certain. There was no accusation in it, just honesty. That's when my mother's smile disappeared completely. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a script. My father stepped in, mumbling something about timing, about misunderstandings, about how this wasn't the place for financial talk. But it was too late. People were listening now. Heads leaned in. Someone whispered, "Did you know?" Another voice murmured, "I thought she was renting." The lie they'd been comfortable telling suddenly had cracks running through it. I stayed quiet, watching. For once, I didn't rush to protect them from discomfort. I didn't soften the truth to make it easier. I let their panic speak for itself. My parents had always been careful with appearances, always curating a version of our family that felt neat and predictable. That version didn't include me quietly surpassing expectations. It didn't include independence they couldn't take credit for. Standing there, I realized something important. They weren't shocked by my success. They were shocked it was public. And in their frantic attempts to regain control, they revealed more than they ever intended to. My sister was still standing in the center of the room, but the energy around her had shifted. The laughter that once surrounded her faded into awkward murmurs. Slowly, she turned toward me, her smile still in place, but it no longer reached her eyes. I recognized that look. Confusion first, then calculation. "What house?" she asked lightly, as if joking. But her voice wavered just enough to give her away. I met her gaze and didn't rush to answer. For years, I'd filled silences to make things comfortable. This time, I let the pause stretch. It wasn't punishment. It was honesty arriving late. My sister glanced at our parents, expecting reassurance. Instead, she found them tense and quiet, their expressions tight. That's when her smile finally fell. The realization hit her in stages: surprise, disbelief, then something sharper. Something that hurt to watch. "You bought a house?" she asked again, more directly now. The room leaned closer, waiting. "Yes," I said. One word. Calm. Steady. Her eyes flicked over me, like she was seeing me for the first time. Not as her younger sister, not as the background character, but as someone with a life she hadn't been aware of. And I could tell that unsettled her. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I didn't announce it," I replied. The silence between us grew heavy. This was supposed to be her night. Her engagement. Her spotlight. And suddenly, it felt like something had been taken from her, even though I hadn't tried to take anything at all. I saw resentment flicker across her face, quickly masked by a practiced expression of composure. She turned back to her fiancé, whispering something I couldn't hear. He nodded, clearly unsure what to do. For the first time, my sister wasn't the most important person in the room. And she didn't know how to handle that. Neither did my parents. And standing there, I realized this moment had been building for years, whether any of us were ready for it or not. That I hadn't planned a speech. I hadn't rehearsed explanations or prepared myself for this moment. But the room was waiting, and the truth, once exposed, doesn't like to be rushed back into silence. Someone asked how long I'd lived there. Another wondered what I did for work. The questions came carefully at first, then with growing curiosity. I answered honestly, without embellishment. I explained that I'd bought the house a few years ago, that I'd saved aggressively, worked long hours, taken risks that didn't always pay off immediately. I didn't frame it as a success story. I framed it as my life. As I spoke, I noticed my parents' discomfort deepen. My mother stared at the table. My father kept nodding, as if agreement might smooth things over. They didn't interrupt this time. They couldn't. I clarified something important then, not loudly, not defensively, but clearly. I said I hadn't hidden my life out of shame. I'd done it because I didn't want my choices compared to anyone else's. I wanted my sister's milestones to stand on their own, untouched by quiet competition. That's when a few relatives exchanged glances. The narrative they'd been fed didn't quite align with what they were hearing now. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't behind. I was intentional. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like stepping into a version of myself I'd always kept private. But they also felt steady. Grounded. True. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't asking for praise. I was simply refusing to shrink any longer. When I finished speaking, the room didn't erupt into applause or outrage. Instead, there was a thoughtful stillness. People processed. Reconsidered. Reframed. And in that quiet moment, I understood something powerful. Once the truth is spoken calmly, it doesn't need defending. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. Conversations resumed, but they no longer flowed the way they had before. People stopped looking at my sister and started looking at my parents. Questions were asked casually, then repeated when the answers didn't quite land. "When did she buy it?" someone asked my mother. "Oh, not long ago," she replied too quickly. Uncle James raised an eyebrow. "It's been at least 3 years," he said gently. The room noticed. Another relative asked how they hadn't known. My father cleared his throat, muttering something about privacy, about how I was very independent. But the tone felt defensive now, not proud. What unsettled people wasn't the house itself, it was the realization that my parents had curated a version of me that didn't exist. They'd spoken about me as if I were still figuring things out, still finding my way, still trailing behind. Now, that image didn't hold. I watched from the sidelines as the truth rearranged itself in everyone's minds. My parents weren't villains, but they weren't honest either. And that distinction mattered. Aunt Laura leaned toward me and whispered, "Why didn't they ever tell us?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, just confused. I shrugged. "They never asked," I said quietly. That seemed to settle something for her. Across the room, my parents stood closer together, their confidence unraveling. They smiled when spoken to, but it didn't reach their eyes. For the first time, they weren't controlling the narrative. No one confronted them directly. No dramatic accusations. Just a slow, collective understanding that something had been off for a long time. And somehow, that was more uncomfortable than any argument. Because silence, when it's filled with clarity, has a way of speaking louder than anger ever could. It didn't take long for the truth to settle into something heavier. As conversations overlapped, fragments reached my ears, half-sentences, careful phrasing, sudden pauses. People were piecing together what my parents had been saying about me for years, and it wasn't flattering. They'd told relatives I was still figuring things out. That I preferred a simple life. That I wasn't interested in big commitments or long-term plans. None of it was technically cruel. It was just incomplete enough to be misleading. A softer lie, easier to defend. Hearing it laid bare like that stung more than I expected. I'd assumed my silence had protected everyone. Instead, it had allowed a story to grow in my absence, one where my achievements were minimized so my sisters could shine brighter. My mother tried to explain herself when a cousin questioned her. She said she didn't want people to pressure me. That she was respecting my privacy. But the explanation felt thin, even to her. Privacy hadn't stopped her from sharing my struggles. It had only silenced my successes. My father added that they didn't think details mattered. That families didn't need to compare. Ironically, comparison was exactly what they'd been managing all along. I stood there, listening, not interrupting. This wasn't the moment for anger. It was the moment for clarity. I realized then that my parents hadn't underestimated me by accident. They'd done it because it was comfortable. Predictable. It kept the family hierarchy intact. But now, that hierarchy was wobbling. People weren't angry on my behalf. They were reevaluating. And that quiet reevaluation carried more weight than any confrontation could have. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I didn't realize I'd been carrying. For the first time, I wasn't fighting to be understood. I was simply being seen. My sister found me near the edge of the room, away from the noise. The music played softly behind us, but her voice cut through it, low and tense. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Not accusing. Not gentle either. Just raw. I looked at her and realized this was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. No parents translating. No expectations layered on top. Just us. "I didn't think you'd want to hear it," I said. Every time something good happened for me, it felt like it complicated things. She crossed her arms, staring at the floor. "You made me look stupid," she said quietly. The words weren't cruel, just vulnerable. "Everyone thinks I live in some perfect bubble. I didn't even know what was happening in your life." "That wasn't my intention," I replied. "I just didn't want to compete with you." She laughed once, bitterly. "Compete? I didn't know we were in the same race." That hurt, but it was honest. She admitted she'd always assumed I was comfortable staying in the background. That my calm meant contentment. That our parents' version of me must have been accurate, because no one ever corrected it. "I didn't think you needed space," she said. I thought you didn't want it. I took a breath. I learned early that wanting space made things harder. We stood there, the truth settling between us. She wasn't apologizing. I wasn't demanding it. This wasn't a reconciliation wrapped in a bow. But it was real. She finally looked up at me, eyes softer than before. I wish I'd known, she said. So do I answered. We returned to the party separately. Nothing was fixed. But something important had shifted. And for the first time, my sister saw me not as a shadow, but as someone standing beside her, equal in the light. As the party carried on, I found myself thinking less about what had been said and more about what hadn't. Years of silence don't happen by accident. They grow slowly, fed by small lessons learned over time. Mine started early, every time I spoke up and felt the room tighten, every time excitement was met with discomfort instead of pride. Silence, I learned, kept things smooth. It kept my parents calm. It kept my sister shining. It kept gatherings peaceful, at least on the surface. I convinced myself that staying quiet was generous, even mature. That sacrificing visibility was a small price to pay for harmony. But the truth was more complicated. I was afraid. Afraid of being labeled arrogant. Afraid of being told I thought I was better than everyone else. Afraid that my success would be treated like an inconvenience instead of something worth celebrating. So I downsized my life in conversations. I softened my language. I answered questions with half-truths and vague smiles. Over time, it became automatic. I didn't even notice how much I was editing myself. What I never considered was the cost. Staying silent didn't just protect others, it erased me. It allowed people to underestimate me without challenge. It allowed my parents to speak for me, to shape my story in ways that suited them. Standing in that room, hearing my life discussed like a plot twist, I understood something clearly. Silence isn't neutral. It takes sides. I hadn't stayed quiet because I lacked confidence. I stayed quiet because I'd been trained to believe that my voice disrupted balance. That my presence needed to be carefully measured. That night marked the end of that belief. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I finally saw what silence had taken from me. And I wasn't willing to give that up anymore. The room was still buzzing with quiet speculation when Uncle James cleared his throat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand attention. He simply spoke, and somehow, everyone listened. I think, he said calmly, we should all stop being surprised that she did well on her own. The sentence landed heavier than any accusation could have. People turned toward him, then toward me. My parents froze. There was nothing confrontational in his tone, just certainty. He wasn't defending me. He was stating a fact. He went on, just a little. He mentioned my discipline, my consistency, the way I'd always handled things quietly and responsibly. He spoke like someone describing the weather, unemotional, undeniable. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because there was nothing to argue with. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father stared into his glass. My sister looked thoughtful, her earlier tension softening into something like reflection. That one sentence reframed everything. Suddenly, my success wasn't a surprise or a disruption. It was a natural outcome. Something that made sense. And in that reframing, the embarrassment shifted. It wasn't about me hiding a house anymore. It was about why no one expected it in the first place. Uncle James didn't stay to bask in the moment. He nodded once, smiled at me, and drifted back into the crowd. His job was done. I felt an unexpected warmth in my chest. Not pride, relief. Sometimes, all it takes is one person naming the truth out loud. And once it's named, it can't be ignored again. After that, the engagement party tried to move on, but it never truly did. The music played, the lights stayed warm, and people kept smiling, yet something essential had shifted. Conversations felt careful now, measured. Laughter came a beat too late, like everyone was waiting to see if it was appropriate. Guests began checking their phones, glancing at the clock. Some said polite goodbyes earlier than planned, offering quick hugs and vague excuses. The energy that once filled the room slowly drained away, leaving behind an awkward calm. My sister stayed near her fiancé, still gracious, still composed, but no longer glowing. She nodded through congratulations, though the sparkle in her eyes had dulled. This night was supposed to be about beginnings, about celebration. Instead, it felt like an ending, of assumptions, of unspoken roles, of carefully maintained illusions. My parents moved through the room like hosts performing a routine they no longer believed in. They thanked people, refilled glasses, straightened decorations that didn't need fixing. Every so often, they glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I felt oddly peaceful. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just steady. The truth had arrived without force, and it had done its work. When the cake was cut, the applause sounded thin. When the speeches ended, there was no rush to the dance floor. The party wrapped itself up quietly, like a book closed before the final chapter. As I gathered my coat, I realized something important. I hadn't taken anything from my sister. I hadn't ruined her night. The night had simply revealed what had been hiding beneath it. And once revealed, there was no pretending it hadn't been there all along. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred past my windshield, and for the first time in years, my thoughts felt settled. Not numb. Not heavy. Just clear. The evening replayed in fragments, faces, pauses, the sound of Uncle James's voice cutting through the room, and none of it filled me with regret. It felt like a chapter closing. I understood then how long I'd mistaken quiet for kindness. I thought staying small kept everyone comfortable, that minimizing myself was the price of peace. But silence doesn't preserve harmony, it reshapes it, often at your expense. Every time I swallowed a truth, I reinforced a role that never fit me. That night didn't magically fix my family. Some conversations would be awkward. Some expectations would resist change. But the version of me they'd grown used to, the invisible one, was gone. And that mattered more than apologies or explanations ever could. I realized self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or seek revenge. Sometimes it's as simple as not rushing to correct discomfort you didn't create. As letting people sit with the truth without softening its edges. Owning my story felt different than proving it. I didn't need to justify my success or translate my choices. The truth stood on its own once it was spoken. That house had never been about status. It was about stability. Independence. Evidence that I could build something solid without approval or applause. And I no longer felt the need to hide it. Families assign roles early, often without meaning to. But roles only last as long as we keep performing them. That night, without raising my voice, I stepped out of mine. And walking forward, I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't shrink again to make anyone else more comfortable.